Greetings, everyone. Welcome to another CLTV Educator, Innovator Hangout. It's July 6th, 2017, and I am Kira Baker Doyle. I'm your host for this evening. I am an associate professor at Arcadia University and the author of Transformative Teachers, Teacher Leadership and Learning in a Connected World, which is the focus of this webinar, this three-part webinar series. Today's conversation is focused on the second part of the book, and it's the second session. And it will be extending some of the work that we talked about in the first session. We have some wonderful guests today. Our first guest is Antero Garcia. He's an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Let's say hi, Antero. We also have Minu Rami, who is a manager at Minecraft, the Education Edition at Microsoft, and she previously taught her students at Science Leadership Academy in Philadelphia.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming, Minu. We have Kathleen Riley, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Literacy at Westchester University in University of Pennsylvania in PA. And we have Christina Cantrell, who is the Associate Director of National Programs at the National Writing Project. And she'll be kind of working with me a bit because she hosted the last show.
Great. Thanks for doing this, Kira. I'm happy to be here. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah. So for those of you who are watching this Hangout, we encourage you to tweet your comments. You can use the hashtag Connected Learning, which is frequently used here. And if you want to talk specifically about concepts from the book, maybe you're reading along with the book, you can also use the hashtag Teachers Transform. And we'll just be following along with what people have to say. So to get started, I thought maybe we could just do a round of introductions and what brings you kind of to this conversation today. I thought maybe we would start with Antero, and you would introduce yourself a bit more other than the one or two lines I put out.
Yeah, sorry, I'm slow at figuring out how to unmute on the iPad here, so apologies for the delay. So I'm new at Stanford University. But I've spent a lot of time both working with the writing project and with teachers when I was previously at Colorado and a teacher in Los Angeles. And in general, I think I'm interested in how we can shape designing opportunities for teachers in their own classrooms and the kinds of flexibility that can happen with that. We'll get into some resources, I'm guessing, throughout this conversation that I've been thinking about around this, but I'm really excited to learn with you, Kira, and everybody else.
Thanks, Antero. And Minu, would you jump in? You've had a lot of great growing experiences since your times starting as a teacher at Science Leadership Academy before. So give us a little history of what you've been doing the last few years.
Yeah, so since I left Science Leadership Academy, where I taught my students high school English, I've had the opportunity to serve as a teaching fellow for the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, working on some of their US-based education work here. And recently, for past 9 months, I've been with the Minecraft Education Edition team at Microsoft. And that's been a fascinating experience to see the idea of students as makers and students as makers of their own learning experiences, and educators figuring out how to use a so-called video game in instructional purposes. So I think in continuing to have the opportunity to teach at Arcadia University, I think all of that combined has led me to think deeply about the role of both the teacher and the students as makers, and what does that actually mean, both in physical and digital world. And lastly, how can I be an active and thoughtful participant in that conversation without taking up too much space or, getting in the way of the conversation. So I guess I'm here both as a learner and an educator, and I'm excited to learn from all of you.
Thanks, Minu. And Kathleen? would you jump in and tell us a little bit more about yourself and what brings you to this conversation? And if you might be on mute right now, you might want to unmute it, or else we might be having a technical difficulty. I think she's going to try and unmute it.
Yeah, Kathleen, try with headphones. No.
We've got visual, but not audio.
Yeah.
Oh, now it's muted. Okay. Yeah, we're going to have our background assistant, I think, help with Kathleen as she gets started. And as he's working with her, maybe I'll ask Christina, both introduce yourself a bit, Christina, but then also if you would give us a little bit of a review of the first session that we had and some of the things that we talked about to kind of bring us into this next section.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Kira. My background is really, I've been able to work at the National Writing Project with you all to really be thinking in the past many years about sort of the implications of emerging networks in online spaces and thinking about connected learning together and connected teaching. So that's the background that I come to this conversation with, and I've worked with you all, so it's really an honor to continue to work with you all and learn with you all, as Mino said. I was particularly excited when, or a bunch of us were excited when Kira's book came out, because in many ways it brought several sort of worlds of educators together, and I think we're all really committed to sharing how are teachers designing and organizing and leading in an increasingly connected world, and really surfacing those stories and practices, and bringing light, being able to shine a spotlight on them. And this book does that in pretty powerful ways. So at Educator Innovator, we asked Kira to work with us to develop a 3-part series. And this first part was a couple weeks ago, and it's called What is a Transformative Teacher? And it really took on the first part of the book, I would say. And it featured Kira as well as our colleague Sam Reed, a Philadelphia teacher who teaches currently at the U School. And I really thought it was powerful in the ways that really, and I would encourage everybody to go, even though it's a webinar, you can listen to it. You don't have to watch and sit necessarily. You can like cook dinner and listen or something. But it's great to hear Sam and Kira talking about both the development of their relationship and this core idea of relationships being sort of core feature of transformative teachers and transformative teaching, and that it's not necessarily about these individual teachers being super teachers, but it's really about this networked power of teachers coming together as leaders and designers of their work alongside their students and their communities. So so for me, it was really that sort of bringing also the worlds of sort of social justice organizing, grassroots organizing together with participatory culture movements and ideas, as well as teacher inquiry and sort of a shared background that many teachers bring to thinking about their practice, learning from their practice within communities of others, and developing their practice through their questions and their experiences. So I feel like the dialogue in this first webinar between Sam and Kira is very rich in that way. And Sam talks about some of his experiences being leading and organizing alongside his students to save his previous school from being closed in Philadelphia, as well as talking about working alongside colleagues to sort of like flip the script on some of the things that were happening, and really thinking about the ways they were telling stories about their work and the context of the work, and really getting to what students need and being advocates for what students need in the sort of systems in which and institutions in which they're working. So I feel like it really, one of the sort of ways they start talking about like collective problem solving, strategic use of multiple kinds of public spaces, and a sense of expertise that's grounded in doing the work. Those are sort of core ideas that cut across. And also what Kira, I believe you are characterizing as some of the principles of transformative teaching and what makes a transformative teacher within these networks of teachers. So I feel like that leads us into this discussion today about really what are some of the ways we're designing, organizing, and leading. We see that happening in the world. Does that help sort of enter us in?
That's a great background, Christina. Thank you. And it's really interesting to also hear it from your perspective. What were some of the salient themes that came out from that last episode? And we do have Kathleen popping back on, and we're going to see if we can hear her this time, and she can introduce herself. Kathleen, is it working this time?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
So I missed Christine's introduction, but I did just watch the first webinar, so I think I'm probably caught up.
Yes.
I'm Kathleen, and I have been studying a series of book groups that are happening in Philadelphia. I'm really interested in teacher learning, teacher inquiry, and teacher organizing. And there's a lot that relates to what's covered in Kira's book that I'm excited to talk about today.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kathleen. You know, the first session that we had culminated in us talking about this idea of building collective agency through collective work, and how teachers build the power to make change in their classrooms, in communities and systems through that collective work. And Sam was sharing some really important stories about that. One of the key ideas in the second part of the book that kind of holds it together is this idea of agentive practices, practices that are used by a community that help to build power and agency. And they're almost like cultural practices. They're like ingrained in a community. It's what a community does to build agency and power. And I look at three kind of big picture concepts of an agentive tool or practice. And within each of those, there's kind of, I would say, more particular kinds of tools and practices. But those big picture ones are making as a agentive tool to help with designing opportunities for learning, both for students and for young people. Students and for teachers, I'm sorry. Hacking, and not the sinister kind of hacking that we hear, but the creative kind of hacking, and the collective rethinking of situations and discourses. And thirdly, connecting as a form of leading. And so these three kind of umbrella concepts that I want to talk a little bit, and each of our guests bring a lot to those ideas and can speak very specifically about what those ideas look like in practice, and how they build a sense of agency in the work that teachers do and do with their students. So I'm wondering if we could start with this idea of making, since Minu initially was talking about how she's been seeing how making and this idea of making has played out in her new context. And I know even before she got into her new context, this idea was really important to her, teaching her students English and writing. So Minu, would you talk a little bit about your understanding of this idea of making? Because that is a a cultural practice that has really grown into many teachers' kind of concepts of what they do as teachers and also as learners?
So I think my own growth as a teacher can actually be traced back to my experience with the Philadelphia Writing Project, which actually brought me in touch with many of the people who are on this hangout, which is interesting. And the agency of seeing writing as making, seeing myself
I think we're having a little issue here.
I think I'm having some, I don't know if you can hear me, but I was having some connection issues.
I think you're back.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'll just read.
I think we might have to step in and lower our bandwidth here. There we go.
Imagine Philadelphia Writing Project. I'm going to actually try to switch rooms, see if that helps connection at all. Sorry, the tour of my office. Is this any better?
Gotta be creative.
Yeah, it's kind of great, actually. Oh, then she dropped. Okay.
Well, you know, while we're working on that technical issue, I know that in some ways the work that Minu has done resonates with some of the ideas that Antero has worked on. And as she's kind of coming back online, Antero, I wonder if you've encountered some conversations with both teacher educators and teachers with this idea of writing is making and makerism.
I like makerism. It's a good word. It's like a Bushism back in the day. I don't know if we do this anymore. Yeah, I think the writing as making space is an important one. I spend a lot of time lately with pre-service teachers as well as in-service teachers, and I think it's a useful way to be thinking about what it means to be writing. I think it as just as language to begin with is useful to be thinking about, you know, what are you making, right? So what is made and its purpose in the world, right? So the kinds of transactional nature of language is important around that. I will say, I think an example I wanted to share is some work from some colleagues in Los Angeles. The Schools for Community Action is 3 public high schools. They're designed around three different themes. There's a game design school, there's a school around entrepreneurship, and there's a school around social work. And I think what links all 3 of these schools are 5 core values that the teachers developed in connection with the local community, with parents, with teachers, with alumni. And those core values are student-centered, community collaboration, innovation and excellence, social justice, and sustainability. And so when we think about what writing looks like across content areas in these classrooms, we think about how is my writing making a more socially just world? How is my writing making the attributes of this school more sustainable? And so I think when we think about what we're making, I would push it towards that kind of social and cultural context, right? What are we making in terms of the broader, you know, socio-political context that we're in? How is this writing speaking back to issues of oppression, to issues of autocracy? I think that's probably particularly important for the teaching profession right now.
Yeah, it sounds like fundamentally making is in its own, it has to be agentive in the sense that you're not being done to. You are the producer and you are the maker. And I also have found that there's some really strong connections between making and design thinking and kind of even the studio approach with art. And I wonder if either you or Minu, if she can jump in, might speak to that connection.
just wanted to see if Minu was jumping in.
The idea that, I really had to find my own via the National Writing Project before I could even imagine my students really, it's the network learning via the National Writing Project that not only allowed me to see my own students' interest, inquiries, and ideas.
Poor Minu, we're still losing her. All right, we're gonna jump, Minu, because we can't hear you. I'm sorry. I know Antero had something he was going to say, so we'll jump to Antero, and maybe you'll be able to pop in a minute.
Oh man, I don't remember what I was going to say.
Sorry.
It's probably really important.
Well, we were talking about design-based thinking and art.
Oh, so actually, before I jump into art, I was just gonna gently push back, because I think you're right that when writing and making points to the agentive nature of it, right, in the possibilities, but also I've been thinking lately around the reading practices, particularly in connected environments, as also being particularly agentive, and many of you on the call are engaged with conversations through things like hypothesis, and with a colleague, Rami Kalir, we've been thinking about, how do online writing practices, reshape the territory of text and authorship and argumentation. So I just think that's another space to be thinking about, in addition to the agentive nature of writing. But I feel like
that's a really great. No, I think it's a great point. As someone who teaches literacy in teacher education, I've found more and more that when I am talking about teaching reading and creating an environment for teaching reading, it's about creating an environment in which there's social, it's about the social, and the social interactions. And it comes back to that. And I really like how you're kind of tying in some of the concepts of the making, the producing with the reading, because they're obviously reading and writing very linked, but the social is intertwined into all of that, which comes back to constructionism and some of the theories that link making and learning together.
Yeah, no, I just add there, because I think like the way you're framing this conversation around reading, writing, and I guess literacies more broadly is an important one for us to be thinking about with teachers, right? Obviously, right? And I think I'm thinking about your book in terms of, how does if a teacher is approaching reading in this process of seeing young people's agency in their relationship with the text, it fundamentally transforms what it means to be reading, rather than having been read to by an author, right? So that author-reader relationship changes, as well as our relationship with the world around us. I just think it's an important, probably, political shift for the moment, hopefully.
That really actually ties in, I'm sure, to some of the stuff that Kathleen is doing. And I hate to jump into a different part of the agenda, but I want to give Kathleen a chance to jump in, because she's been working with teachers in book groups. And that, again, there's a lot to that. So would you jump in, and what are your thoughts, Kathleen?
Yeah, I mean, I'm hearing a lot of resonance between what has been said so far and my work in Philadelphia. Basically, what's been happening in Philadelphia for the past 4 years is that 2 education justice organizations of teachers, the Teacher Action Group here in Philly and the Caucus of Working Educators within the Philadelphia Teachers Union, have been co-organizing and co-sponsoring a series of summer book groups that educators read over the summer. These book groups are, I think, a great example of sort of that maker mindset of creating the container in which new ideas can form. The books that the educators have chosen to read, and it's a democratic process of selecting the books each summer, have really focused in on justice, social justice more broadly, and people who are in the book groups are always thinking about how education relates to other systemic issues like racism, school closures, neoliberalism, mass incarceration, immigration. So these are spaces where I think there's a lot of potential, and the educators are using them intentionally as an organizing tool, as a place of leadership development, as a place of understanding the world differently in order to act on it. And I think it really just relates to that idea that you were talking about, Kira, of leveraging agency and building collective power through these spaces that they're creating.
Yeah. I want to give Mina or Christina a chance to kind of chime in on this part of the conversation. It does lead very, very well into the next point, which is around this idea of hacking. But let me give you guys a chance to jump in and make connections.
Yeah, I think I kept getting disconnected, and I apologize for the connection. But I love Antero's point about not only seeing as students as makers, but also helping teachers think about themselves as makers. Because in my experience, I never felt comfortable asking my students to do something or try something that I wouldn't be willing to do so myself. So I think until educators get comfortable with the idea of whether it's connecting, hacking, or making, they can't really expect their students to pick up those ideas and run with. So I love the importance of it in your book and in Antero's comment.
Great. And since we have you, did you want to add, I think that you were about to share a story about your practice, and I'm not quite sure what it was, but yeah, you got cut off earlier.
Connection. No, I think I was just saying that I had to figure out my own identity as a maker and a writer before I could teach writing or introduce the idea of my students as makers in my own practice. And for that, I really thank a lot of people on this Hangout and the National and Philadelphia Writing Project for taking a teacher through that evolution of, you know, I guess I'm going to teach writing to I teach writers. What is that transformation like for a teacher who's often scared and unsure, like we all are when we're starting our practice, whether we're teaching teachers or whether we're teaching ninth grade. So, you know, I think back on my own evolution and the importance of first figuring out myself as a maker and a writer before I could ask anyone else to do the same.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's powerful, connected to Kathleen's description of what the teachers are organizing and the sort of democratic ways that they're deciding, you know, what they're going to read together, and that sort of agency as readers and being in that, having those experiences themselves around the things that they're caring about and wondering about. So
I think if it's okay, Kira, I'd like to add one more point about empathy, because I think when you think about all three of these ideas, whether it's making, hacking, or connecting, I think the core of it is empathy, and core of any classroom practice is also empathy. If you can't imagine it from the perspective of the students in your class, it's probably not going to work very well, whether it's an activity, a unit, or a way of thinking that you bring to the classroom. So I don't know if anyone else wants to touch on the idea of empathy, but it kind of struck me as I heard other people's comments about the importance of empathy and what it might mean for the growth and evolution of one's, you know, teaching practice.
I think it's, you know, I love that point. I think, so when I've talked about hacking in various places, I've tried to connect it to this idea of teachers being vulnerable. But I also want to just recognize, I think it's a pretty precarious time to be vulnerable as a teacher in this moment. And thinking about the kinds of challenges that both teachers and students are facing in classrooms. Some colleagues I've been working with in Colorado, and particularly a doctoral student, Becca Kaplan, and I have been thinking about how do we attend to the social and emotional learning needs of teachers as well as their students. And particularly around empathy, the language we're using is CAPE. It's like a superhero cape that you wear both as a teacher and as a student. And the CAPE is caring, advocacy, perspective taking, and empathy. And really is about trying to understand both the feelings of other people in order to be, a more purposeful human being. And I think, as you're pointing to, Minu, someone who can meaningfully make and meaningfully act and connect, but also as a way to better understand yourself, right? That there's this kind of reflexive process of both being able to contribute to and understand the people around you, as well as contribute to and understand your own needs and the health of yourself as both a teacher and a learner.
I love that.
Just to add to this idea of empathy and thinking about the space of a book group, when I was reading, some of Kira's ideas, I was thinking about this ideas of hacking and repurposing the idea of a book group as a professional development tool and as an organizing tool. And reading together has long been a way to create bonds, to create connection, and to create a sense of understanding a different point of view. And so by creating these reading groups in the summer, it's really allowing space for teachers to be human in a different way with one another that then influences the way that they work throughout the year and the way that they see the world. And so a lot of capacity for empathy within that kind of structure as well.
Yeah, and I want to add to all, I think all of this, I think that some of the themes that are coming out here, I mean, in essence, we have this idea of making and producing something, and then also the centerpiece of it, of the building this sense of empathy. But I think another part that brings it all together is this idea of the process and the slow growth, that it takes time to build the relationship, to build the empathy, build the ability to develop empathy, to develop one's understandings of the perspectives, and that there's this, that in making anything and designing anything, that's a process too. So I think that the thing to remember with all of this work is that it's slow, right? It takes time. And that you're doing it in these small little steps of building opportunities to develop the relationship, to develop the sense of empathy, to develop all of the things that you make, and to refine them and to rethink them. And we're kind of in this time when everything needs to be, very quick and perfect, and that's a hard thing to kind of convince oneself to do and to have faith in and to trust. That kind of a process. So that it really speaks to me, hearing the examples and the stories folks are sharing, and how important that process is.
And I'm thinking, Kira, too, of just underscoring a point that I think you make really well in the book too, is that transformative teachers transform within the context of others and within the context of those relationships, and that it's so any one of us might be at a different point in that sort of process, right, and in that growth. So when we network together, we actually really exponentially develop out our capacity to do some of that work, right, because we have that sort of collective, we can lean on each other in those collective ways. And I just think that's so important, and to think about it and the power of that in the collective, I think brings us back to how these tools can be so powerful, wielded by an individual and wielded by a group. They have a real power to grow.
Yeah.
I think additionally to the point of learning in a community, I think there's also a need for a safe space when learning in a community, because oftentimes, as Kira said, this work takes time and it may or may not work. So whether it's an idea implemented in a classroom or a teacher advocacy group making a play at transformation in a district, it may or may not work. And how do we handle so-called failure, or how do we build the resiliency and the tenacity to try again? It's also an interesting aspect of this work that we ought to honor and recognize. And I don't know if you all have experience or personal, been touched by this sort of idea, but I think I would love to hear that.
Yeah, I would say that one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, Minu, is the relationship between spaces, third spaces, places outside of kind of systems, and systems that often kind of force us to make some choices that sometimes we're not so happy to make. And the relationship between spaces and collaboration and networking, how when we build relationships and we network, sometimes we are in essence building those spaces, and how those spaces can be sources of important growth. So for example, I think Kathleen's example of the book club is a perfect example, right? So that's a space that's built by people coming together outside of, this institutional system to really rethink how to address some important problems there, right? That's hard to do it like within their individual context, but when they come outside of that and meet outside of that, they start thinking differently. They start being able to take those kinds of risks.
Yeah, and I just would add, when you said safe space, Minu, I was thinking about, the trust that it takes to talk about issues that are difficult. And there's a couple of examples of book groups that have actually turned into ongoing inquiry communities. So one example is a book group focused on whiteness and being a white teacher, teaching in a space where you're mostly teaching students of color. And that started off as a book group for white folks who teach in the Hood and the Rest of Y'all Too by Chris Emden. And now it's this ongoing group that meets. And so I think, teachers are really carving out these spaces where they're able to have conversations that require some vulnerability. And so I would definitely say, I think the idea of sort of building over time and building spaces where people can take risks is really, really important.
And can I just, as an educator, like applaud going beyond a conversation and turning it into an action and research group, so that oftentimes I think teachers are frustrated that we talk about things, but what do we do about them? So I love this idea that, conversation leads to inquiry groups or action research or partnerships or visiting each other's classes, and that's the rich learning that can happen when we're learning in a community.
Yeah.
I feel like this connects really well to your concept, Kira, in this chapter or this part of the book around connecting through leading, actually. So, and I've a colleague of ours, Chad Sansing, in the past has talked about like leadership as creating spaces for permission. That leadership isn't, a job or in the hierarchy or but actually that it's really about starting to create spaces for permission for people to work and be authorized to do work, and to authorize themselves to do work. And, it makes me think about InkChat and even just the way that you sort of opened up a space for English teachers online and how that was, starting to build a safe space, or I think I'd wonder what the relationship between that was and the building of safe spaces comment that you made.
Yes, certainly. I think it was, again, my own attempt at seeking such a space to say that I don't know everything there is to know about teaching students reading, writing, and thinking, and there ought to be a place where I can turn to other teachers and ask for help. And certainly, I think that's one of the things that was the bedrock of that community, was that you could come as someone who's curious, and you could come as someone not knowing something and feeling comfortable to learn and grow with another educator.
Yes, and I think one of the things that bringing into this concept of the relationship between connecting and leading, that Minu's point was that she wanted to connect with other people. She didn't say, I'm going to be this leader in English education. She said, I want to connect with people to learn with them. And through that, it kind of, she became a leader. It was something that kind of that wasn't a hierarchical kind of label, but more of a person who helps to connect people, right? And so what I want to challenge folks to think is to rethink this idea of what we understand leadership, traditional leadership, to be, of this kind of very hierarchical person on top, to what if we thought about instead focusing on how can we connect with others to learn with them, and maybe even take steps to be that person who helps to connect people. It's not for everybody, not everybody wants to be that person who connects, but how can we think in a way that of trying to find opportunities to learn with others? And I think that there's that transforms this idea of leadership into a very active, a very meaningful and active way that makes sense for teachers. The teachers, we come into this profession looking to help others, looking to connect and build relationships, and we can live into the idea of leadership in a much easier way that way than from a very hierarchical perspective.
Which goes right back to the point that Christina, you made in the honor and wisdom of Chiat Sansing, that leadership is about creating spaces for permission. Really, it's about doing the work. And I think it's interesting that all the people you've gathered here, Kira, would be called, so-called leaders. But speaking for myself, I think we've all sort of are self-deprecating and find humor in it, and just want to keep doing the work, and want to keep learning, and want to keep having these opportunities for learning to happen. And Tara just said he does not find humor in my comments, so there's that.
Yeah, actually, and Tara, we haven't heard from you for a while, and I wonder if there was any comments that you wanted to jump on, or that you're having some thoughts on.
Yeah, I do. I do agree with what you're saying. I think this idea of leading, I would also point to, particularly in classroom contexts, as well as with other teachers, as a process of modeling the kinds of civic behavior we're hoping to see, beyond our classrooms and beyond just teacher professional communities. Another of our colleagues who could be on this conversation is Nicole Mira, and she talks about this from a lens of civic empathy. And I find that pretty important and useful for this conversation. I was also just going to add another resource around this. There's a bunch of S words that were being molded together at one point. So things like spaces being safe and slow and small. And I'll add a couple more around these. And so Kathy Fleischer in Michigan has been doing some advocacy design work for the National Council of Teachers of English. And so has created a tool set for educators around taking action around localized issues at the website everydayadvocacy.org. And she has really emphasized, and I think in a really useful way, the idea of taking action that is smart and safe and savvy. And so just to add more S words to our conversation, I thought those would be maybe useful.
And Taro, I think that Sam suggested that same website in our last session, so there must be some real synchronicity in that. We definitely want to go check that out.
Definitely, yeah, cool.
Yeah. So great suggestion, and I love all the S words here. And I see that we're kind of running low on time. We started a little late, but we're running low on time here. And I think that we've really had a great kind of conversation hitting on a number of these topics. I wonder if folks have maybe some last thoughts or words that they kind of want to share that maybe link some of these ideas or just come into mind before we wrap it up.
I just had a
Kathleen?
thought that this can be my concluding thought, and it's I really like how we were talking about leadership and really trying together to redefine leadership from this hierarchical model. And like you, Kira, I've been doing a lot of thinking and reading about community organizing and what it means to be an organizer. And a really big concept in that world is this idea of leadership identification and leadership development. And I really think a lot with the ideas of Ella Baker around leadership and this idea that leaders are people who can move others to action, that leaders are really developed from the ground up, and that leaders are people who have influence over their peers and who can get people to do things together. And so, I'm really just hope we can all keep thinking about how we can build leaders within the worlds that we live in.
Yeah. And I have to say that I just finished teaching a course with a very short course with some fabulous international educators. They were doing some future research, and one of them raised this question. She identifies as an introvert, and she raised this question of where do I find space in these conversations about collaboration and connecting and reaching out as someone who's an introvert. And we know that there's a large percentage of the population who's introvert. And she already did some really interesting work around this and found that one thing to kind of think about when you're dealing with folks who really need a different kind of environment to thrive as a connector with others is to think structurally about how to set up opportunities for folks who need some smaller groups, some private time for reflecting and thinking. And so I guess I just wanted to introduce that into the mix, that when folks hear words like collaboration and leadership and community, I think there's a good number of people who get intimidated, not just because of that leadership label, but also because it just that the dominance of extroversion in the collaboration conversation, and that we also need to think about introverts and how to bring them in. It's not that introverts don't want to connect, it's that they connect in different ways, and that's an important piece too. And I only got that from connecting with an introvert.
Well, I love that. I just want to say I love that Ella Baker came into the conversation. And so for me, this the opportunity of what are we learning about connected learning and sort of the potential of sort of new spaces and places that we can create into spaces of permission for us to work and do work. And then what do we know from organizing over time that moved populations, that engage people, extroverts, introverts, everybody in a community around needs that they saw in their community. And so I think I'm really excited about the opportunity for those conversations to connect, because I think there's a lot that is known historically and that we can tap into and use and develop out today.
Yeah, there's still so much to learn. Go ahead.
I was just going to add quickly, I think I really appreciate all of you bringing up both Ella Baker and bringing up that most of these conversations in Kathleen's work have come up around community organizing. And it's probably important for us to remember that we're usually in those kinds of conversations because we're organizing for or toward something, right? And also as a form of writing, probably, to be thinking about. But that this is a particularly important time for us to be thinking through, you know, what are we making, what are we hacking for, right? And it's probably towards enactments of liberation and justice, and that those should be, you know, those should be joyful in the kinds of ways that we're moving toward them. But this is an important time for us to be thinking critically about this, right? We have federal structures that are challenging the face of public education right now, and I just don't want to diminish that fact in this conversation.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Antero, and I think it's, you know, sometimes we can, these ideas get exciting, but the reality, also we have to recognize the reality of how in some way, in a lot of ways, these ideas become more important, but we also need to talk about them within that reality, and recognize that over and over again. Minu wanted to say something.
Yeah, I think I'm so glad that you brought up both our civic life and the current climate under which we all live, and no matter what our, you know, personal or political beliefs, we can't deny the great burden on teachers and students in these times. And I wonder what the need for, you know, learning in a community, how that is shifting, and what the role of, you know, teachers who teach teachers, or teachers who prepare teachers, or you know, district leaders who support teachers, how their role evolves and transforms during this time. So it's absolutely important to keep working towards and figuring out how do we provide a safe and inclusive learning environment for both teachers and students everywhere.
That's great. And Kira, I'm just wondering if we could say some of the things that people are organizing to support these continued conversations. Sure. And then we can send out some links to those in that context, because I think that would be valuable.
That would be a good way to kind of wrap up. So I know Kathleen wanted to share a bit about the book groups, and then if other folks had things to share about things that are being organized right now, some agentive practices in motion. Kathleen, I think you're on mute again. But this time it really is mute.
I'm going to try to share a couple of things on the screen, if that's okay.
Sure.
So these are some of the books that we've been reading over the years, and I can somehow share this with Christina to get up. And then I'm not sure, can you see? The other things that I'll send out as links are there's a blog that the book groups keep. So the book groups write into a blog, and then it's compiled so everyone can read about all the other books that are happening. So I'll share that. And then I'll also share an article that sort of gives an overview of the book groups for anyone who is interested in sort of replicating similar types of practices in their own locations.
Fabulous, thank you. Minu or Antero, did you have any resources to share?
You know, I think the importance of self-care and giving yourself hiatus from whatever, you know, usual intake of news you might be on right now. I think just the importance of asking for help when you need it, asking for support from loved ones and community members around you, I think is super important, and finding and creating the spaces that you need, and again, knowing that you're a leader already and no one needs to crown you for you to do the work. I think is super, super important to keep in mind.
Great. Thank you so much, Mina. That is really important. And Tara, you got the last minute.
I think I'll probably just echo Mina's resources and probably steal all of Kathleen's book list to read. I'll also just add, in case it's not on there,
what about SLAM?
And well, I'll also add SLAM, but I don't want to share too many resources. I will say I'm rereading The Bluest Eye, Toni Morrison, and maybe we should all just do that. I don't know. That seems like a good thing. I do run some online advocacy website, webinar-y things. If you want to take a look at that, you could go to slam.education and find out more there. Really care for yourself more than that.
Great. That's awesome. Wonderful resources for folks. I guess my resource to share, and this might be something that Christina is going to share too. So that what exciting thing happening this weekend, which is July 8th and 9th, is a gathering of folks who are interested in connected learning, which is all about connection and learning, and teacher education. And so we'll share some links out to folks who want to kind of follow along in the virtual world with that gathering. And the hashtag for that, if you want to kind of follow along on Twitter, is hashtag CLINTE. So CLINTE. And that should be great, a great opportunity to connect with folks who are thinking about a lot of these issues.
That was what I was going to say. We tweeted it out. So.
Awesome. All right. So I think we're starting to wrap things up. I want to say thank you so much to our guests for joining us. You are all so amazing and awesome and bring so much to the conversation. I learn from you every time. To the audience here, thank you for joining us. If you want to stay up to date with future opportunities, you can sign up for the monthly newsletter at educatorinnovator.org. Or on the Twitter handle at Innovator, innovates_ed. Yeah, I think that's it. We're going to wrap things up. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Kira. Mm-hmm. And people
Thank you
should
so
join
much.
us in a week too for the third part of this. So
right. Yes, we will be doing a third final session. So keep in tune for that.